Great. Okay, so let's jump straight in and just acknowledge, obviously, I'm down at Claremont at UWA on the campus, obviously just acknowledging that we are on Noongar Whadjuk Budja and pay acknowledgement to traditional owners past and present. So we've been asked to provide a little bit of a background to ourselves, which I think is a great way to go in terms of, particularly for you guys, Year 12, getting ready to do what's next. So hopefully I'll just ground how I became an archaeologist and ended up in Western Australia and ended up excavating the Batavia before we talk about that as well. So I grew up in Tasmania on Palawa country at a time when Indigenous knowledge in our understanding of kind of the Indigenous history of place was extremely poor. So when I was in Year 12, it was almost unheard of to actually think about such things. Though we obviously, a place like Tasmania, named after one of the great VOC explorers, Abel Tasman, and so we knew a little bit. I probably knew more about the Dutch East India Company than I did about the people whose country I was on. And one of the things that's happened is it's taken me a little while to end up working back in Australia, but now my work tends to deal a lot with the ways in which people come into contact with each other. And I just wanted to share this. This is the cover of a book. It's a textbook in North America I wrote a few years ago, which deals, I guess, with the global history of how different people come into contact with each other. In the case of Batavia, obviously, it's through a shipwreck. It's a kind of a different type of extreme contact. But this book's more about how cultures engage with each other, particularly in the colonial world. And the cover of the book is what I want to talk about. That's the proclamation that was hung up around trees in Tasmania in the early 1800s. It was a commitment by the governor at the time that, if people were kind to each other, they'd get along, and if not, then there would be violence and justice. But of course, that's not exactly what happened in Tasmania. And soon after this, the so-called Black War erupted, and terrible consequences for Tasmania. So I kind of came to education with not much understanding of Australia, but a great interest in the past. And like you, I ended up at university. Well, some of you will end up at university in coming years, and had to figure out what I wanted to do. I thought I was going to be a geologist. Actually, I thought I was probably going to be a marine biologist, and I got into James Cook Uni, which was the degree at the time to do marine bio up in Townsville. But I decided to start with Melbourne Uni and see what happened. And a bit of a different time. I was the last year of free university education. So as you go into university, the cost of a university degree is something that is quite overwhelming in many ways. And so it is worth noting that I at least got 1 year of free at the end of that era. And I didn't become a marine biologist, obviously. But what happened is I became very interested in culture, both of the past and the present. So I had a couple of opportunities very early on. One was this one, which is a bit ironic, in that I went, the entombed warriors, the terracotta warriors, were brought to Melbourne in the late 80s, and I went and saw them, and I was absolutely blown away by them. And it's, as you may know, they're back here in Perth. Some of you may have even been down to Boulevard and seen the wonderful archaeological exhibition of this material as well. So I saw these guys, I was like going, well, I'm interested in how that's a job, archaeology. I also got to work in Arnhem Land with Yolngu people of northeastern Arnhem Land, and I became really interested in Aboriginal cultures. And I was like, oh, there's things to do in that space as well. So I did a degree at Melbourne Uni, and mainly in archaeology and anthropology. And I got a letter from a professor in Turkey. He said he'd be willing to take me on to learn how to excavate. And I, like many young people, I just wanted to travel. I knew how to write, but I didn't know much about archaeology. So I ended up in eastern Turkey and started work on a site called Eganis Tepe. And it was an extraordinary experience. Unfortunately, it was also a place with essentially two war zones. There was a civil war. This work was happening in Kurdistan, so the Turkish military were essentially at war with the local villages where we lived. there was also the edge of the Gulf War. So there was a lot going on. I'll come back to that. But I learned how to excavate on wonderful Bronze Age palaces that had been burnt to the ground. These are the kitchens of a palace. They're the tops of giant pots that stored all of the food for the palace. And I got to meet a lot of young Turkish guys, local villagers, probably only with a primary school education, who were paid barely nothing by the Turkish to actually work on these sites. A very different time. And around us, there was just war. And so it was a time when in northern Iraq, people were being gassed by Saddam Hussein, fleeing across the border, and I would meet them at night time, and we would talk. And so it was a really eye-opening experience. So I guess the point being that travel, you never know where your degree is going to take you, but it was interesting, a really interesting and important experience for me. I ended up realizing there was no place for me to find work in Eastern Turkey. I looked at Georgia and Southern Russia and a whole bunch of places, and ended up back in Australia and decided I really wanted to learn more about, the history of Australia. And so I spent 9 months living out in Lake Eyre, in the middle of the desert. I wrote a book about that, which is there. I had a 4-wheel drive. It was fantastic. And I learned how to be an Australian archaeologist. I got to work with Aboriginal people. I got to really kind of get into a whole range of incredible debates that were happening in the late 90s about Australian history, the so-called history wars, where there was a lot of contention between, whether or not, how Australian history should be told, etc., etc. It was all rather dramatic at the time. I think we're kind of past that, and we're now in an era of truth-telling and other things as well. I got a PhD at Sydney University, and I got a job at UWA. And when I arrived here, suddenly nearly everything I did seemed to have a bit of a maritime theme to it for the first time. So in the years since, I've worked on many sites underwater and maritime sites on land. I've surveyed rivers and lakes for archaeological material, and because of the nature of West Australian history, there's very much a coastal theme to life in Western Australia for many Aboriginal people over the last 55,000 years, and so the sea, the coast, is very much part of what we end up doing, whether it's deep time or very recent. And the great thing about a degree like archaeology is that it doesn't restrict you to one place. So I've also got to work in places like Scandinavia and Stonehenge and other amazing excavations, and really honed my skills as a technical excavator and surveyor. The places here in yellow are all of the Aboriginal communities that I've had the good fortune of working with. So you can see most of them are actually in the deserts and coasts of Western Australia. So very active projects in the Kimberley, in Albany, along the Pilbara coast and islands and what have you as well. And as part of that, I got invited by the WA Museum. When I got offered a job at UWA, the Vice Chancellor said, "You've got to start a relationship with the WA Museum," which I did. And they said, "Well, why don't you come and help us excavate some sites related to the Batavia?" And like most people in Australia, I didn't know anything about the Batavia. And that's probably true for many people still in Eastern Australia, whilst the Dutch shipwrecks are something that you guys in Western Australia understand quite well. So I'll come back to the Batavia, started work there in '99, but also many other coastal places. So just particularly currently, we're really focused on the Kimberley, where there's an incredible amount of marine related work happening across heritage, marine science, coral studies, and all the rest of it. So this is with Parks and Wildlife establishing a new national park right at the very tip of the northern Kimberley. And I just want to show you just one little video here. This is us working on the beach at Napier Broome Bay. There'd been saltwater crocs there that morning, and we're excavating a range of fireplaces that you can see there in the background, which all relate to Asians coming down to northern Australia to harvest trepang or sea cucumber in the last few hundred years. So this is something that we know almost nothing about from history, but through archaeology, you can see that dark material there. They're the remains of fireplaces from Asian fishermen who have come down to northern Australia on the monsoon for hundreds of years And for the first time ever, we're beginning to date that material as well. So nearly everything we do in archaeology tends to be very, very closely related to our wonderful coast, which you can see here, Napier, Broome Bay. Okay, so I'll skip through this last bit. Obviously, lots of working with people. People skills are really essential as well. Archaeology requires incredible teams, as you're about to see, and so I think having a sense of that is really important as well. Okay, so I'm going to just jump straight into the Batavia. So I understand from Scott that you have in this class, but anyone else watching this, on YouTube later on, hopefully will have some sense of what the Batavia is. So I'm not going to do a huge amount of background to the Batavia, the wreck of the Batavia in the Abrolhos Islands in 1629. There's some wonderful sources on that story, and so you can find some easy references to that, and we'll provide some as well. So let's just jump right in and basically talk about one particular, our project work up there. So we started working again on the Batavia in the last 2 decades, particularly since 2015 on a project called Shipwrecks of the Roaring Forties. Those of you who have any understanding of the way the Roaring Forties work, which is this incredible strong wind pattern that moves across the southern part of the globe, would probably point out to me that the Roaring Forties are actually well south of Western Australia. But it was such a great name for a project that we decided to use it anyhow. It's not quite correct. So we have we brought together a whole range of people from all around the world, some of them listed here, the British Museum, lots of partners from the Netherlands and as well, to basically look at a range of sites in Western Australia. So Western Australia has some of the most amazing maritime archaeology, particularly in the form of shipwrecks anywhere in the world, and particularly for Australia. And this is something that we're trying to get the news out about as well. If you're in Perth and you haven't been to the shipwreck galleries at the WA Museum down in Fremantle on Cliff Street, you definitely should. What we're looking at there are 2 bits of that. One is the wreck, the actual hull of the Batavia, an extraordinary artifact in its own right, and one of the individuals from the Batavia as well. So we wanted to return to evidence related to the Batavia using a whole range of different technologies, scientific expertise, and visualization techniques to do new research, to profile the important collections that were here in Western Australia from the Batavia and other Dutch East India Company sites, and also do a lot of forensic archaeology. We have a team here at UWA of forensic anthropologists. We have a centre here led by Dan Franklin, which is kind of one of the leading centres. And so we were able to kind of really start to look at the human remains as well. So just quickly, by way of explaining why we have shipwrecks along the West Australian coast, I mentioned the Roaring Forties. So it was the case in the 1600s and the 1700s in particular, when Europeans increasingly found their way to Southeast Asia, what is currently Indonesia, for various resources, but particularly spices. So the Portuguese had made their way into Southeast Asia in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and established themselves there. The Dutch in the early 1600s arrived and really turned it into an extraordinary commercial enterprise with global dimensions. We kind of think of what the Dutch were doing as the first global company. So moving goods from Southeast Asia and India and other locations back to Europe and making extraordinary profits. The Dutch also created a new route to Indonesia, and that was across the bottom of the Indian Ocean. Rather than crawling their way up the African coast and around the Indian coast, they sailed directly across the bottom of the Indian Ocean, turned north and sailed north. But as a result, there was a hazard, and that was the West Australian coast, which was pretty poorly understood, though increasingly the Dutch did come to understand it through exploration and trying to find some of the missing ships. So there's 4 known ships from the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, the Batavia, 1629, but also the Zeewick in the 1700s, the Vergoulderdrecht closer to Perth in 1656, a site that we're working on at the moment with some new discoveries that are about to be announced, and also the Zeitdorp, north of the Abrolhos Islands as well. And that little inset there, you can see this is the Abrolhos Islands, so out from Geraldton, about 50 nautical miles, and you can see the kind of the group of islands there as well. Just on there's a little table here, and it just shows us. Oh, that's in the way. I can get rid of that. Okay, so you can actually see some of these are some of the collections that are in the WA Museum and the National Maritime Museum now from these sites. The Batavia has an extraordinary amount of coins, and that's because these ships were actually taking coins to Batavia, what is now Jakarta, as part of the currency that undermined that the company needed. So a little bit more detail. We know about the wreck of the Batavia because it was a best-selling book after the events of the Batavia. So in 1647, this book, Unlucky Voyage, was published, translated into many languages. It was one of the first major maritime disasters that became a global story in its own right. So 316 people on board, many of them die and are murdered. It's never really been made into a successful film, although we've been involved with several attempts to do it. But as a result of being wrecked in 1629, people are stranded on the islands of the Abrolhos, particularly Beacon Island. Pelsart, who's the most senior company person, basically sails in an open boat to Batavia to seek help. But whilst he's away for nearly 3 months, there's a mutiny led by a person named Cornelius, who basically convinces a range of other men to join him, and they assaulted and eventually murdered over 125 of the survivors from the wreck, which is just a monumental tragedy, and obviously one that's very hard for people to get their head around. So Pelsart returned with a rescue boat called the Sardam and captured the mutineers, and they were basically, some of them were hung, some of the survivors were rescued, etc. So we're very interested in this kind of telling of this story, because other than the book, there's not much, the sites themselves disappeared into history. And so our work has been on the islands of the Abrolhos, trying to figure out as much as possible how we can use archaeology to tell us about what happened in these events, particularly on the wreck site, but equally on the islands themselves as well. It should be pointed out that when Pelsart came back and captured the mutineers, there were two elements that are worth pointing out. One is that there'd been a successful set of resistance to Cornelius and the mutineers, and that had been led by Webby Hayes, who was a soldier, basically fairly early on after the shipwreck, when the survivors had ended up in the island. Pelsart's gone. The mutiny is beginning to get underway. Cornelius recognises that Webby Hayes and a group of soldiers, mainly French soldiers, were a threat, and sent them off to another island, and then said, when you find water, put up a signal fire, and we'll come and find you. The great problem with most of these islands is they're small coral islands, no water on them, and so people were dying of thirst already. Webby Hayes made it to a large island, did find water, set up a signal fire, and no one came. And it was, in months that followed, eventually the mutineers would attack Webby Hayes and this small group of soldiers, who basically did fight back and eventually captured Cornelius just as Pelsart arrived. So there is resistance to the mutiny. Also, after Pelsart had come back and settled everything, there was also a massive salvage exercise. So they stayed in the islands for 6 weeks, diving the wreck of the Batavia, getting as much of the coins and other goods from the islands as they could to take it back to Jakarta. So here's a quick summary of the causes of death. So I said about 316 people. So we have most of them been murdered. You can make out in the bar graph there, but also many other people dying of thirst. Many people drowned on the wreck site when it first occurred. Other people died of other various things, but most of them were murdered or died of thirst or drowned. So moving forward 400 years to the 20th century, in the islands, people had been in the islands since the 1800s, mainly mining guano, so bird poo, and mining guano at a commercial scale. And they'd found a whole bunch of Dutch material on these guano mines, and they actually thought it was the Batavia, because people knew about the book. It was actually the Zeewick. It was in the southern group. So if you do visit the Abrolhos, in the southern group, you have islands that are named after Pelsart and others, but they're actually unrelated. They're actually related to the wreck of the Zeewick, which is in the 1700s. And the real wreck of the Batavia was in the northern group, in the Wallaby group. And people became aware of this in the 1960s, particularly through the work of Henrietta Drake Brockman, who's pictured here on the left, the historian. And she basically had done some historical research, and so was able to determine that one of the islands in the northern group, in the account, they talk about an island with cats on it. So there's no cats in the Abrolhos, but she realised that it was actually these small Tamar wallabies. And so she started looking in the Northern Islands. You can see here in this picture, you can make out the grave and the shack. So there were fishermen living in the islands, and so members of the fishing community became increasingly aware of some of these remains. You can see them collected here as well, including human remains, coins, and other bits and bobs that kind of were starting to circulate around the fishing community. This was an era as well at the beginning, really, of the invention of a new field of study called maritime archaeology. With increased access to scuba diving equipment, after Jacques Cousteau perfected that in the mid 20th century, divers were increasingly able to access sites, and archaeological scientists were able to access sites. And so Jeremy Green was recruited by the WA Museum, and in the 1970s began work on the work on the Batavia. There was no real plan to actually retrieve as much material as they did, but that's what happened. And as a result, we have this extraordinary wooden hull and other material, cannon and all the rest of it from the site. So some of those early discoveries we can see here. Hugh Edwards, who passed only last year, a well-known West Australian who was a huge advocate for the site. You can actually see him investigating one of the skulls there with a brutal cut mark in the top of the skull. So that's the one you can actually see there in the WA Museum. We had these early discoveries. Most of them we know about now. This gentleman, you can see a whole side of his skull has actually been removed, and so again, and you can see a cut in the back as well. So this is someone who has suffered incredibly terrible, murderous blows, probably with a sword or an axe to the head. I started work there in around 2000. There'd been a discovery. Beacon Island is the closest island to the shipwreck. So the Batavia was excavated in the 1970s, and then work went fairly quiet. And then fishermen started bumping into some of the remains. You can see here in this image, obviously there's a mass grave, but on the left is a leach drain. So that's a drain going from a toilet. So when they dug this drain, they've hit two skulls. At this stage, the state government was aware of the potential for archaeological material on Beacon Island. There were clear instructions to not dig any holes. So when the fishermen did dig holes, as in this case, they tried to, at first they didn't really know what to do, and it took a long time really before it became clear that this particular site had been discovered. So it was excavated by the WA Museum and us. There are 6 individuals in this grave. And then jumping forward in time, we then sought to have all of the sites listed as a National Heritage Place. So this happened about 15 years ago. And so this meant, you can actually see here in this image, in the bottom right here is the Batavia Shipwreck. Nearby, across the reef, you can see Beacon Island. And then moving towards the west, you can actually make out this larger island, West Wallaby Island. In between is some smaller islands, but particularly a very long island called Long Island. which also has archaeological material, which we'll get to. So these sites were all listed as a National Heritage Place by the Commonwealth, and so that allowed us then to start really planning to how to deal with this really significant heritage. One of the first things that the state government did after many, many years of trying was to basically remove the fishing community from Beacon Island. There are other islands where members of the fishing community live, crayfishermen and others. And then the huts were eventually removed. And it was during the removal of those huts that we monitored for sites. And you can see they're just below the surface. So they're just very, very, very fragile interface. We did lots of remote sensing. That's basically a term we use to basically say looking underneath the ground using different techniques. We use radar, resistivity, where we run electrical currents through the earth to see if we can kind of see an anomaly. We used also, same thing can be done with magnetometers using magnets, and we tried our best to find out where there might be sites related to the survivors of the Batavia. Beacon Island is tiny. It's not much bigger than a football ground. And so even in that small area, we still needed to try to figure out where the best places where sites were, which is why we tried using these different techniques. This is a map of Beacon Island, and we started work there in 2014, and we continued to find burials. So of all those people who died on the island, many of them have actually been preserved in burials, so single burials, multiple burials. So I'm going to run through those as well. So I probably should have pointed out at the start that there are obviously images here of human remains. The first one that we found was this individual in 2015. You can just see the top of the skull coming out of the excavations there on the left. And this is another one that was excavated fairly early on. This is actually a body with no skull, except for this tiny piece of cranium. And it's actually the missing piece of cranium that had been picked up by the fishermen in the 1960s. So this skull had long been in Geraldton, but the rest of the body was actually underneath one of the shacks. And so we carefully excavated that as well. This little image here, it gives you a sense of how sandy the deposit is. Oh no, it won't. Let's try it again, hopefully. It's just using photographs to create a 3D image. And you can see there's an individual there, the first one that was discovered in 2015. And then we'll remove some of this overburden here. Here's another individual. So now that first one's been excavated out. And this is actually two individuals. So we will, in a second, you'll see the upper individual removed, and then there's an individual underneath. It looks like they had their arms around each other. So two individuals there. So we had, within 2 years, we found these three victims of the Batavia fairly early on. You can see how terrible it is in terms of a very sandy deposit to actually excavate in. So I'll just whiz through some of these because we're running short on time, but and you can look up all of this in some of the publications we've done as well. There's a great book called Shipwrecks of the Roaring Forties that talks through all of the things that I'm talking through here today. So we started to find individuals very much damaged by the rising seas, and that's something we have to think about. And sometimes, but with actual material culture, so artifacts. This individual, for instance, had musket balls in their pockets. None of the clothes had survived, but the musket balls were resting against their body. Was wearing a bracelet made out of amber from the Baltic. Very beautiful material, very popular in the 1600s. Even tiny evidence of past clothing parts. The green staining on this rib is from a clasp, which would have been copper. And you can see some of the other copper clasps here as well. These actually have fabric that has survived on them. So that's the oldest European fabric. These are the oldest European burials in Australia, I should point out. So they're very significant in terms of their age. Hairbrushes, they're really more like lice combs. This is actually, the one on the right is from the Batavia Shipwreck, and the one on the left is from one of the burial sites, so very similar materials. And here's kind of a map. Those open areas with the grids are where there used to be the fishing shacks. The land has been rehabilitated now, but it gave us an opportunity to excavate. So all of the kind of funny coloured bits are where we excavated over the years. This is Jeremy Green, who's now retired from the WA Museum, finding a wonderful apothecary pot, so used by chemists to hold kind of medicines. Here's one of the later burials that we found. This is a mass grave with 5 individuals at the top. You can make out there. Hopefully this will work. And then, so there's 5 individuals, 4 lined up quite neatly, and then 1 kind of put at the end. And we thought we were done with this one, but then when we remove these individuals, there's another 2 individuals beneath, so these 2 as well. So there was 7 individuals buried in very shallow graves here as well. And the key to a lot of this recording is photogrammetry, so just a technique that we use quite a bit, using lots and lots of photographs to build some of the 3D models that you can see here as well. It's easy enough to do now with your phone. And we have lots of questions around the burials that we're continuing to work on. So I just want to point out a couple other sites. West Wallaby Island is where the mutiny, the soldiers were based. So this is the hut. The one on the left is the hut where they were actually based, and we excavated there and found a small amount of Dutch material. It was a site that has been picked over for many, many years, so it was surprising that there's any material there at all. You can see the hut there, so that's West Wallaby Island. You can see it's a much larger island and much more suitable for survival. These are some of the earliest book part remains in Australia. They're probably from a Bible or from a journal. These are clothing parts, the ends of shoelaces, some lead tokens. And the final site I want to talk about is the execution site. So we knew that when Pelsart came back to the islands, found the mutineers, that he found them guilty, and he executed 7 in the islands. He actually chopped off the hands, because to steal from the Dutch East India Company, one of the penalties was to have your hand chopped off. In the case of Cornelius, both hands were chopped off and then they were hung. And after years of looking and surveying, using mainly metal detectors, we found this site, and it's a massive concentration of ship's fastenings. And we think that this is where they built the gallows, probably out of wooden parts of the ship, and they basically would have hung the victims. And leaving victims hanging on gallows was a really common practice. This is some images from Van Gogh on the outside of Amsterdam. And so you can see these are people who've been executed and just left there as a sign to warn others as well. So we probably think that they left the individuals hanging there on Long Island, and eventually they just would have collapsed, and all we have left are these metal parts of the ship. So we have a lot of questions that come out of the work. Just a couple that I just want to focus on. One is we have the human remains of now 22 individuals from the Batavia that we're looking at. And so the work that we're doing at the moment is with scientists from all around the world looking at isotopes. So everything we eat as individuals is reflected in our bones. So if we spend our life eating lots and lots of marine species, then the chemical signature of that looks very different from if we end up eating lots of other things as well. And also the waters in the part of the world that we grow up affect ourselves as well. So one of the things we're doing is finding out where from in Europe all of the 22 individuals came from. So we're doing this with the University of Amsterdam and the University of Leiden, and so we're actually about to publish all of that at the end of the year in a big paper. And it turns out is that people came from places like the United Kingdom, southern France, Scandinavia, came to the Netherlands to join the Batavia. So it's a real European workforce that's turning up in the individuals who unfortunately never made it to Asia. So this is just some of those. This is what a plot looks like. So these red dots are likely places where we're going to get the isotopic signature that relates to this gentleman here, SK11. And this is using strontium to figure out the water that they consumed when they were children. So just one example of kind of the work that we continue to do. And I can talk more about it if you have some questions about some of the other specific parts of the project.